We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No collusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Welcome to The Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothkushel.
So let's preface this first of all. We just did a program last week, I believe a week ago Saturday on Clubhouse, where we read from and analyzed and discussed the article Zionist Logic by Malcolm X. So a thank you to people who checked that out for our Antidote Deep Core Text series. And also thank you to people who have checked out part one of our friend John Swinn's documentary, The Unauthorized History of the American Century. We have uploaded part two on our Patreon page, and we are gradually going to be uploading the rest of the series, which is 5 parts in all, onto our Patreon, and that's of course at patreon.com/theantidote. And thanks to Jeremy for providing the voiceover narration for the documentary series, and people check out John's documentary, as I feel like it's a very really connects some dots to some very important, crucial aspects of the previous century, and a lot of some of the aspects of how we got into the situation we're getting into here. And I look forward myself to finishing the rest of the 5-part documentary. So
yes, me too. And just the first part that's been released is very, very interesting. And the amount of research that John did in order to put this all together is really incredible. And it really goes through so much crucial, it fills in a lot in terms of the background here, the crucial history. And really some of the most interesting stuff that I would allude to that's in this is stuff that has to do with some of the aspects of what we were talking about in the early Trump days, about the background of like the John Birch Society. And it goes so much deeper than we covered on the surface. And John just puts all of the names and dates and explains what a crucial piece that was. It ties in the question of Hollywood, the rise of the national security state, if Israeli interest, all kinds of interesting stuff in there, and I'm interested in going through the whole thing again with the video. And I was very happy to be able to narrate it, but to see the whole thing with the way that John put the graphics together and pieces it all together, I'm really interested in. So yeah, so that's at our Patreon page. I believe the second part right there is there for Patreon subscribers, and because John put in so much work on this, and so all right, check that out. Very interesting film.
indeed, and yeah, so definitely we'll be definitely check that out, and feel free to check out the 5-part series on our page, and at least check out part 1 and then decide if it's something, checking out the rest of it. And thanks to John for the work he's doing. It really is one of the people who's out there doing work, I'd say, that really needs to be done in terms of really getting as full scale of a picture as we could possibly get of the events, of the important events of the last century, leading up to in a lot of ways, to the moment we're in as a country and as a world. So hats off to John for that. And
yeah, and anyone who's familiar with the totally unique in terms of both the presentation and the collation of information around the key historical stuff is familiar with John's graphics. His infographics, and it's basically, now this is in moving form with narration and moving graphics and some historical footage, and just a really incredible piece of work he's put together.
Indeed. So yeah, please feel free. Yeah, so please support John's work. And so anyway, on our front here at the Antidote, as I mentioned, we at the top we do have a new clubhouse, club extreme deep core text, which was Malcolm X's Zionist Logic, written in September of 1964. And this, Jeremy, this is the first chance we've had to sit down and do a long form recording, actual more general kind of discussion based conversation regarding the events of the past month, of course. And once again, I mean, this has been quite the month, as once again the situation in in Palestine, Israel, Palestine, and Gaza literally blew up once again. So we're going to take this opportunity. We might split this into two parts. We're going to take this time to discuss a bit of like an overview of what took place and a combination of the events that took place. We have an interesting timeline we're going to read from regarding the behavior of and the complicity in the of Prime Minister Netanyahu and in the events that went down. And we're also going to discuss some of the dynamics in terms, I think, the shifting domestic attitudes towards the conflict and how that differs from the reaction of the Biden administration, which is still a lot of the worst aspects of like of the worst of the compromising of the American political system to the Zionist lobby, to the Zionist project. And then we're going to discuss a debate we listened to that I think just shows how so many in like the quote unquote alternative media that we've always been considered part of, although I increasingly don't consider myself a part of this apparatus anymore. But just an example of how wrong some of the conversations that are being had out there about this the nature of this conflict are. So let's start out, Jeremy. Well,
I would just, before we just get into it, I do want to just point out, I would like to start out with the question of one of the key aspects of this moment where it feels different than before in the quote unquote so-called conflict is actually the question of terminology. And these kinds of terms that I used to sort of have to struggle to call into question, even in my own mind, because they're habitual. They're the so-called polite or accepted way that journalistic society talks about this situation is the quote unquote conflict. That's now being overthrown properly especially by the Palestinian people, who are really in many ways doing incredible work to push forth what I think has really been a long-term, very clear, simple, I would call political consensus amongst the authentic Palestinian grassroots, where all of these political weapons have been piled on top of it, where they include terminology such as the conflict, where to describe an ethnic cleansing project, an ongoing military occupation, and a national genocide. And we can talk more about that the questions, the conflict over the term of genocide. And I think it's very clear that this idea of a national genocide is very obviously what is part of the long-term Zionist project, which goes into everything such as the co-optation of food, arts, culture, and any Palestinian can tell you all about that, the hummus wars and all of that. But even to the question of Palestine, even in this debate that we listened to, Owen Schroyer himself did total disinformation on this front, where he refused. I don't believe in the after aspect of the debate, he took calls, and I'm almost positive he never said the word Palestine or Palestinians once. Now, I may be wrong, but in general, at the key moments when he was describing what they were talking about, he said, a reoccurrence of this conflict, between Israel and the Arab world was the way that he would describe it in many ways. And so increasingly, too, it's so obvious now that after the Abraham Accords and the overt, quote unquote, normalization that went down under Trump, that was then pitched as a quote unquote peace plan and the peace in the Middle East and all of that a lot of these Arab neighbors are totally in bed with the ongoing Israeli occupation of Palestine. in exchange for giving up the Palestinians. They got security contracts, weapons deals, access to cyber weapons, the political public coup of the whole in the America bipartisan consensus that this was a good thing. And I would also point out the ongoing cover-up that these same players, especially in terms of the highest levels of leadership in the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, specifically Mohammed bin Salman, were part of the Red Sea conspiracy, the 11/9 operation to install the entirety of this horseshoe debate between someone like Barnes and Fuentes, but all the way to Alex Jones himself, and definitely Owen Schroyer. The main thing they all have a consensus on is Donald Trump's politics are still God. And it's a debate about whether Donald Trump just sort of got taken in too much by the Israel lobby. If you're Fuentes, and that was the problem with it, was America first, was to Israel first, or that it's being overthrown, the strong investment in Israel's security that Donald Trump made, if you're from the Barnes contingent. But all of them totally agree on Donald Trump's politics as the way to go. So the fact that under this kind of historical moment, that this is not, that Owen Schroyer is pitching this as something just sort of the endless spiral of conflict between Israel and its Arab nemesis, the Arab world, is total BS. And so these kinds of words, such as the conflict, the quote unquote peace process, the two-state solution, these are more and more being totally exposed and degraded as just tools of long-term propaganda to reinforce the ethnic cleansing project and the military garrison state sponsored occupation of the Palestinian people that's backed by all of that. And so this is why I think this moment is different in many ways. And I've been listening a lot to rooms of Palestinian people talking, including the Palestinians in diaspora, people from all, realms of the solidarity networks in terms of other folks in parts of the Arab world or the Muslim world, or Palestinian solidarity folks in the West of Jewish and Christian backgrounds, or atheists or left backgrounds. But it's all, there's a consensus bubbling around the clarity of describing the situation. And, this comes on the heels of the Human Rights Watch, decades after the Palestinians were very clear about what this was, that they've done a over 200-page report about that Israel is clearly an apartheid project of some sort. And at the same time, all of these terminologies, I would say, that are then put on top of this that I think are more accurate than the question of the conflict or the two-state solution or the endless spiral of violence or the peace process and all of that, such as settler colonialism, ethnic cleansing, apartheid. All of these terms also have their limitations and potentially lead to not dealing fully with the unique aspects of this situation and or the extent of it. It's very different than apartheid South Africa in many ways, not only in terms of the relationship of the people supposedly at quote unquote conflict. And imagine describing, a rape as a conflict, or, that's sort of the issue with these kinds of things. But I just wanted to just say that first and foremost, because this moment is where this is beginning to be unlocked. And anyone who just listens to sort of like, to InfoWars, quote unquote, debates about the quote unquote conflict are missing what's actually going on in this moment that's actually new. And then, of course, you and me, Greg, we also feel like we have a key component to understanding this that I would say virtually no one in the media circles, let's say, that would include in sort of Western and American-centric Palestinian solidarity network circles are dealing with. But meanwhile, I would just one more time refer to that what I referred to in our Antidote Deep Core text show about Malcolm X's Zionist logic, that while listening to some of these rooms in relationship to Palestinians talking about their situation and the situation on Clubhouse, that a Palestinian woman was very, very clear when she pushed back about using Telegram as some supposedly better security approach to communications than WhatsApp, by saying, no, the fact that Russia is it has some background in Russia is not a good thing necessarily, though we understand that Israel is Russia's Silicon Valley in the Middle East. Okay. So I believe that's the Palestinian, the level of understanding of the Palestinian street, that you're not going to hear that from any of the Palestinian solidarity networks in the West. And so this is the next thing that I think needs to be understood by those who actually want to hold to account and resolve this ongoing occupation. And then how that occupation and how the quote unquote special relationship between the United States and Israel has been a key geopolitical strategy of tension point for many, 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 many decades, and that it might hold the key to helping unlock, and I think this is mutual in relationship, we who are Americans in relationship to those in Palestine and Israel-Palestine, let's say, because there's aspects of this where the aspect of where it is a cycle of violence, and we'll read through a timeline of how when the violence escalates, and clearly the disproportionate levels of violence as usual are visited upon the Palestinian people, and this time specifically against Gaza again, the people in Gaza, in a totally criminal manner in terms of what the Israeli military was doing. And now things have come out that things like targeting the building where some of the journalists were, and everyone talks about how it was an AP building and Al Jazeera. But meanwhile, the Gazan Palestinians have incredible grassroots journalists who have been filming a lot and making sure that things happen and are exposed, and a lot of like smaller journalists who are Gazan indigenous journalists were also located in that building, and yet the virtually the entirety of the world press just focuses on the AP and even Al Jazeera, I would say. So there is this aspect where that unlocking the quote unquote cycle of violence, that's not a quote unquote cycle of violence, but it's a long-term strategy of tension based on deception and terrorism, really. And that includes the latent terrorism that's driven by psychological propaganda, such as Alex Jones perpetuated in the middle of him being a neutral moderator in that debate, where he basically says, I can't, what I've seen now, you can't just hand Israel over to the Muslims. I mean, to the Palestinians. I'd be scared to even live with them in their neighborhoods. They'd probably kill me, he said. And meanwhile, the history of the Palestinian people is so far beyond that. What I've heard in the way that they've held their identities together and the courage of their dignity in the face of this intergenerational attempted national genocide, which is exactly why the Zionist project over a long period of time tries to deny that there is a Palestine or that there are Palestinians, and which is why people like Owen Schroyer are basically just little tools of Zionist propaganda when they try to talk about it as just the Arab world. Sure, that's ethnics. That's ethnicity, Arab. But meanwhile, there is also all of these national projects got going around the same time, late 1800s, early 1900s. And so the Palestinians also have a national project. And this, of course, is what's being attempted to be genocided. And it doesn't just mean that it's all about just sort of wiping people out by death, but it does have to do with the combination of national genocide in all its forms with ethnic cleansing. And if all of this can be unhooked and we can do truth accountability, then restitution, reconciliation, I would say across the board. And this is where it's mutual, the interest between the United States and Palestine and folks in Israel too, is that it will unhook this quote unquote cycle of violence that really is a geostrategy of tension that is very global in its dimensions and is maintained by deception and terrorism. And so that's where I think we want to understand where we might need to go, that there is a mutuality of interest in this moment of people of good faith, and then also with a commitment to morality and the equal dignity of all human beings.
Yes, indeed. It's interesting you mentioned, I believe you referenced the Human Rights Watch report, which officially labeled Israel an apartheid state.
Yes.
It's very interesting because that is, I think, and you alluded to it a little bit there, the shifting in terms of like the reaction and even the terminology and the way things are described and the way by very establishment, very, you might say, elitist in some ways, publications, think tanks, etc. And that is one of the major things of this. I mean, you mentioned, of course, the disproportionality of the violence that meets the Palestinians in this conflict. You have hundreds of, I believe, over 200 children were killed in this latest event, plus many hundreds others injured throughout aspects of within the state of Israel itself, within the West Bank, within Gaza, and the shifting tide of public opinion with regards to this, I think, is a very interesting sight to behold, because we've been talking about among ourselves like the way like media is covering this. Much of the media, still not all the media, and still not nearly as strong as it needs to be. But I mean, there is this shifting in terms of like, I mean, even programs, channels affiliated with the Late Show with Stephen Colbert is openly broadcasted on CBS, formerly headed by the great nephew of David Ben Gurion, and now disgraced Les Moonves, saying flat out, Israel is committing war crimes, and the ridiculous defenses that Israel uses, or the Israeli government uses to, and media mouthpieces use to like defend the aggression, etc. And then, of course, the shifting tide of public opinion. And I think I've held that this is one of the major reasons why there's this, despite like the fact that the U.S. government and the European Union, we can go in maybe into a little bit of the here in a bit, the contrast in terms of the shifting tide of public opinion with the way the Biden administration has handled this, with, of course, I think the Biden administration epitomizing the problem of like the long-term compromise of like the American state of our system to this Zionist project, in terms of entrenched within our power structure. But the shifting tide of public opinion, and one of the things I think that like the more hardcore, more passionate proponents of the Zionist project have been very concerned about, despite how milquetoast at best like any sort of like pushback is towards like the policies of Israeli government over the decades, by the U.S., by the European Union, which still largely enable the illegal activities, but are just, despite that, there's this fear. I think it's an inevitability, much like with other matters, that over time, as a population gets less and less monolithic, and as populations become more and more technologically savvy and move and have more of an understanding of like these types of events outside of like simple control of a few media outlets, and as well as a population more inclined to like just accept the older populations, which simply rely on like network television and a few magazines and radio to give them the news. And now with the more increased avenues of being able to get information, etc., this inevitability that public opinion would begin to shift on something like this. And I think that's happening now. And I think that's a large part of why there's been these particularly like a hostility towards like the liberal establishments of these Western institutions by the likes of Benjamin Netanyahu and his proponents and his agents and assets here in the West. Is this shifting of public opinion? I think they're very concerned about that. And of course, you've had a congressional shift as well, where people in Congress are speaking much more, still not as forceful as necessary in a lot of ways, but speaking much more openly and I think about the nature of like what's going on here. I think there's been more congressional pushback than we've ever seen before in terms of outright just condemnation and criticism of Israel's handling of the events, and once again it clashes with the Biden administration, and of course the MAGA, the powered MAGA wing of the Republican Party is as bad as anybody would expect them to be. I mean, unfortunately, but there is this shifting of public opinion, and it's a very interesting moment because it opens up, I think, for people from our perspective. I'm concerned about, as usual, like about the parameters of like the conversation being controlled and maybe limited in the scope of where things need to go. But at the same time, there is this opening of like consciousness with regards to this. And I think that we might discuss this more a little later on down the line. I think there is an understanding that some more aspects of the American population, I think, can see, although, we don't have like, I don't think we have like the equivalent of, particularly like the military operations, which just took place in Gaza, happening here domestically. But there are elements of the American, population that can at least be much more empathetic with like the Palestinian cause based on their own history in this country. And then on top of that, you have this understanding, I think, of like what you talked about for it, even aspects of like the grand bargain and this multinational global effort to install a person like Donald Trump to so transform the global geopolitical picture, as well as it just seems to cause as much chaos here domestically as possible, and the primary role of somebody like a Benjamin Netanyahu. And so in this moment, while I'm worried about like parameters and discourse limitations being put in place, that's always something to be concerned about, as trends have shown us. But at the same time, there is this opening to where I think we can begin to really responsibly, and that's why it's important to be responsible about it. The opposite of what we're going to, what you talked a little bit about with this Fuentes Barnes conversation, and we're going to talk about it a bit more, I think. The opposite of that, but it can be responsibly and with credibility presented. I think there could be a conversation about aspects of things, serious discussion about things that have not been discussed like out in the open, the way that we could potentially begin to steer and have conversations in the direction of what you're talking about on Clubhouse with some very serious figures who I think have a large understanding of like the a combination of like the historical aspects of what some what some Americans could relate to by and large based on their own experiences, as well as the complicity of the person, as we're going to get into with this Twitter thread, who I think is a large portion of the blame for the events of the past month lie on, being a central player like in our own political and geopolitical instability, being at the forefront of this as well. So I think, and seeing this shift in public opinion and consciousness and hearts and minds, basically, in a lot of ways, I think there's areas, as I said, just to be a bit wary of that, but at the same time, be very, very optimistic about. And you don't want to be optimistic about things like, you don't want to sound like that. Like, we're not optimistic about, military operations that leave, hundreds of children dead and all untold amounts of destruction under the guise of continuing a criminal occupation of a people. But, there is linings in terms of like conversations that we can be having to continue to change the tide and change the discourse and where it can go, and openings up in terms of having some very important, deep conversations about topics that I don't think the opportunity was there for in the past.
Yeah, and I agree with you in many ways, and I would only distinguish between what we might call optimism and hope, which is the question of passive versus active. And optimism is sort of like, just looking at something and that things are going to work out in an optimal way no matter what we do. Whereas hope is an active imperative, where the reason why we might act is because there is hope towards accomplishing some moral end of some sort, or something good, something positive. And I think that is exactly, there are openings here. And at the same time, because it's just openings, and that if we don't figure out how to move through those openings, how to facilitate our movement in strategic directions, then the quote unquote pessimistic outlook becomes the what will happen. So that's I guess where I can see these openings right now. And it's interesting because we can get back to this after we go through the factual background, the timeline, as you just referenced, from an Israeli journalists and activists documented perspective of how this was just totally orchestrated, this kind of mass murderous violence, really, that killed, quote unquote, both sides, by the Prime Minister himself. And like you said, Greg, this is a crucial piece this again, and we can keep referring back to how we might see the question of this fraudulent fake patriots with a PAY of Alex Jones, and then hosting this horseshoe debate that basically is just a reaffirmation of Trump in many ways about which side of the America first versus Israel special relationship do you fall down on, a situation that is this is what we really, I think, need in order to unlock this, is the specifics of these political interests in many ways. And a key lesson, I think, from the Palestinian streets and the organic Palestinian intellectuals, if you're actually willing to listen to them, which we can more and more in this day and age, is that the main way that they've been disrupted and continually occupied, both in mind and body in many ways, for 3/4 of a century, just in terms of 1948 and the state, but also 100 years really in terms of the advancement of the Zionist project, and a certain kind of bait and switch between the question of a return to a Jewish homeland by Jewish refugees, especially then with ultimately sort of capstoned in the context of the heightened destruction of Jewish life in the European Shoah context. But that was then utilized in many ways as a bait and switch in relationship to what the actual Palestinian peoples, it's very diverse ethnically, religiously, and very confederated in many ways, and very land-based and differentiated and articulated in terms of regions and families and all of that. There was an openness, and there was a political opening, really, a room. There was room for an authentic Jewish return to a homeland as one of the peoples that would be there. And then in place of that, you then get the Zionist terrorist ongoing state occupation, ethnic cleansing project, and national genocide that in order to have the Jewish homeland backed up by the Jewish state and the entirety of that so-called security apparatus there, then it's there to really secure in many ways the success, the ongoing maintenance of the original and then ongoing ethnic cleansing project. And so the main thing that we can learn from them is that the way that they were undone was by having leadership put in their place, or have leadership put in front of them that was not actually their voice. And that's what you see over and over again for anywhere from the quote unquote Oslo, and very interesting things happening now in terms of the background of some of the Norwegian players in the Oslo Accords, direct Epstein connection there. HBO just put out a film, I guess, about that from the Norwegian perspective, and the key players who are featured are deeply tied to, the man is deeply tied to Epstein, actually, until fairly recently. So go look at that. We'll include some links about that. So the Oslo peace process, again, then links into Epstein. I would say this is a key point that needs to keep coming up. But the PLO, remember, this is like the Palestinian Authority coming out of that. Then now you have a leadership to manage the occupation that can then be blamed for never missing a chance to miss a chance. Then you have Hamas and that whole background in terms of the 80s, and part and parcel of the facilitation of Islamic counter gangs in many ways by aspects of the West and UK, US, but that in an Israeli context. And so I just see it now as a structuralized undermining of leadership in order to obscure the simple long-term political consensus that is totally logical, that is basically when they say from the river to the sea, Palestine should be free, they are not calling for driving the Jews into the sea or the genocide of the Jews. It is basically an end to the apartheid state project. And sure, during the end of apartheid South Africa, were there those who were scaremongering about driving all the Afrikaners and driving all the whites into the sea? Sure. But was it real? I mean, that's, so there's a lot to be, I think, learned from this, how the fake leadership in both political structure and in terms of language and terminology is the way to maintain a long-term military occupation. And as I brought up in an interesting room that we can talk about more there later, which is sort of the more sort of liberal, it's the cultural normalization effort that's going on on Clubhouse, where it's under a club called Balance, and they say meet Palestinians and Israelis, and they sometimes allow for Palestinian voices, but they always keep it contained. As from what I've seen, there are some Palestinian moderators, but it's dominated by Zionist moderators. Maybe they're liberal Zionists, but I see this as part of the entire sort of packaging of the normalization process, and that this is still really just a conflict. If the people could talk, then this wouldn't happen. And sure, there is an interesting aspect of where the walls keep apart the peoples. But meanwhile, this is a political conundrum that's kept in place by not being willing to address the truth about the deception and terrorism that maintains the situation. And all right, so let's get to some of this, Greg. This timeline, is that cool?
Yeah, let's do this. So, you sent me this thread. It's from it was put together on May 17th, which would have been 2 weeks ago, Monday, by Israeli journalist by the name of Orly Barlev, and she looks like a very interesting person herself. At one point, she was the editor of the preeminent Israeli newspaper Haaretz news editor for 1 year, and also, Israeli military veteran. She's described on her Wikipedia profile as the first independent journalist not backed by a media organization who was accepted to the Israeli Journalism and Media Council. Her operation is funded by public donations. And as you've said, Jeremy, it seems this thread here, it's very similar to some of for some of our listeners, Seth Abramson, familiar with his breakdowns of aspects of what he calls the grand bargain in terms of the a lot of the events surrounding like Trump and this multinational geopolitical axis around him of countries of more than an axis. I mean, but it's similar it's similar to thread to this where it's very detailed in a numbered sequence of posts regarding like the timeline of events, chain of events, as far as this basically being something largely orchestrated and carried out in order to keep for Netanyahu to cling to power in a very precarious time for him. So we're going to be reading from this, going through this Twitter thread by the Israeli independent journalist Orly Bar-Lev, describing the chain and timeline of events.
All right. Yes. So this is this is obviously from an Israeli perspective, from an Israeli, someone of some influence and interest in Israel. This journalist and activist, now a public interest journalist, is what it could look like. What you pointed out in terms of she's the first publicly funded journalist in many ways in Israel, and especially when you look at what Netanyahu is facing in terms of his corruption indictments, a lot of it actually ties into the media, of course, and which newspapers he's using state power and state assets in an unethical way. Of course, Sheldon Adelson, people like James Packer from Australia, people like Arnon Milchan, all of these kinds of billionaires are tied in here, and this is all also about media control in Israel too. So this is very interesting to hear this from this perspective. So that we'll give this forward as I would say it's the best fact-based analysis of the origins of this latest series of atrocities by the Israeli leadership. In this case, Netanyahu. Okay, so Orly Bar-Lev, quote, the chain of events led by Netanyahu to set fire to Israel to cling to power. Okay, that's the title of it. Okay, that's what she's asserting. The chain of events in Israel in the past few weeks leads to the inescapable conclusion that Netanyahu instigated the fire in Israel in order to hold on to power, to escape his trial.
Okay, and real quick before you keep on there, it's very interesting. She talks about mentions, the fire in Israel, and it's interesting. I don't think we're going to really get much into it in this recording, but it is interesting that even the state of Israel itself has seen what has been described by many as previously unseen levels of conflict within the outside of the usual areas that are usually focused on as far as being the center of a lot of the events that we've known that have come into the global public eye over the course of decades. In terms of, I believe some people, they'd have been described as even like Israel, like being on the brink in some cases of civil war, and whether that's a little hyperbolic or not. I mean, it's interesting that there has been, and I just thought of that when I mentioned instigated the fire in Israel, almost like similar to what we've identified with like certain American actors, almost like somebody like a Netanyahu himself almost seems to be willing to maybe set the country on fire and not even just simply carry out like the usual operations in places, but actually within the state of Israel itself in terms of people and things taking place just domestically that don't normally flare up. So it's interesting.
Oh yeah, and I would say that's a very good point. That I actually believe that it was Netanyahu's intent to escalate this thing even more than it did. And remember, they were testing out. I didn't complete this thought earlier, but that it was the Israeli Air Force was reported to have bombed the press building to let off steam. Okay. And then remember too, there was reports that they were amassing a ground invasion potentially. And that could have been just psyops, but I also think that there was a sense that Netanyahu was going to escalate this, and because he benefits directly politically, where the sort of more centrist-oriented Lapid group, which articulated certain aspects of, like, they tried to talk down the mobs of Jewish Israelis who were marching around, beating Palestinian Israelis and chanting death to Arabs by saying this is not us. But once rockets start getting fired and bombs start dropping, all of that rhetoric goes out the window and everything becomes about national security. We know that intimately from the United States, where we're still living under post 9/11 America, and the nature of the emergency security operations have transformed. Some of them have sort of faded a little bit. Others have been escalated, especially around the pandemic and the biological threat and all of that. But we understand the nature of how powerful the idea of escalating a quote unquote national security situation is in terms of bringing the quote unquote conflicting political sides together. So I think that what happened was that this time was different in terms of this was actually a rising third intifada in relationship to the Palestinians domestically in Israel that was totally unprecedented. And I think that the actual Israeli national security folks who weren't interested in Netanyahu setting the country on fire for his own political motives, combined with aspects of, certain American diplomatic interests and probably other parts of the world, and especially in Europe, and, a little bit more behind the scenes kind of stuff, probably de-escalated the situation, partially because it could have led directly to an actual civil war chaos thing, but not amongst Jewish Israelis politically, but really as a third intifada in relationship to the uprising of Palestinian solidarity in many ways, in a way that would be totally new. Now, some on the ground in Palestine, but also in the Palestinian diaspora, still see this as the ongoing third intifada that is much more information warfare at some level, and the winning of the hearts and minds in many ways. So that, I think that's interesting to note. But in general, Greg, I think this parallel that you're drawing in terms of these direct links to something like Trump is crucial. And this is why I keep on bringing up Trump in relationship to that fraudulent Alex Jones hosted debate. Is that we've seen exactly this. And of course, that's what they're in full denial of in this American fake patriot context, is that we had a guy do this very recently. And meanwhile, there is their political people are the ones who are trying to suppress even the knowledge that this actually happened, or that it's been credibly established that Donald Trump was not an American first patriot, but really in many ways an asset of some of the worst elements of the corrupt American establishment, in combination with being a long-term direct asset of something like Russian intelligence, with an obviously very strong Middle Eastern supercharger to it, and a long-term direct relationship with someone like Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu. And so we saw the way that this can happen, and the fact that this is not being linked directly. This is not just sort of an Arab-Israeli conflict. No, this is Netanyahu doing something very similar that we saw Donald Trump do in relationship to our country, which we also escaped from the potentially worst immediate outcomes, only to have the long-term takeover be potentially further cemented in a full-on cover-up. So this is why we need to understand the political specifics of this, and not just attribute this to the latest round of the Israel-Palestine conflict, or Israel's war with its the Arab world. All right. So let's get to this some more. Orly Bar-Lev, quote, Israel has been on fire since May 10th as a result of what seems to be a deliberate plan. It appears the escalation was orchestrated by Netanyahu and executed by the Kahanist MK parliament member Ben Gvir, extreme right-wing party, through incitement on social media and carried out by Israeli police, controlled by Netanyahu's loyalist minister Ohana to provoke confrontation between Jews and Arabs, and to provoke Hamas. All of the above just days before Netanyahu was about to lose his seat of power after 12 years as prime minister. Netanyahu, who is now standing trial for multiple counts of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust, has provoked the latest round of violence as part of his desperate attempts to cling to power and sabotage the democratic process to replace him following recent elections. Okay, that's the end of the fourth tweet, unquote. And I just want to point out, and I'll try to say when I'm going from tweet to tweet here as we progress through this. But this is, again, I want to make the link to the obvious fraudulent nature of the Alex Jones debate between Fuentes and Barnes by the way that Alex Jones talked about Netanyahu, in terms of the only sins of Netanyahu was that he didn't support Donald Trump enough, and that he said that he wants to microchip people. And those are the two things that Alex holds against Netanyahu. And of course, in the moment, we pointed out very specifically exactly what the timing was in terms of the apparently reluctant immediate recognition of Biden as the president-elect, and then a relinquishing of then congratulating Biden over Trump. And we distinguish between Putin, who held out a lot longer, and Netanyahu. And Netanyahu was the leader of a so-called ally friend, and Putin is the leader of a nemesis. Okay, and but Netanyahu was not eager to sell out Trump. No, that's not what we saw. And that does not mean that there isn't a continuity, obviously, of what is the Biden agenda in relationship to Israel, and a very strong Epstein-Maxwell current going through the Biden administration that we will dip into more in forthcoming weeks. That's crucial, I think, to both understanding and deconstructing this situation. But that fact of that Netanyahu, it's not. Alex didn't even mention that Netanyahu had been indicted and that he had political considerations. And of course, remember the last time Alex touched on this was that Netanyahu is just much of a political victim, a target of political warfare as Donald Trump was. And we haven't heard anything different.
If they bring down Netanyahu, they're coming for Trump next.
so that, I guess the order was
Trump
reversed.
And Putin. Yeah, Trump and Putin. Trump, Putin, and Netanyahu were the triumvirate of patriots there for a while.
Yeah, exactly. All right.
But now it can be shifted to fit into a narrative of Israel can be, or Netanyahu can be good or bad depending on what narrative you want to push at the moment. But it's never going to be for the actual, it seems like the actual main obvious reasons anyway.
All right, back to this Twitter thread by Orly Barlev. And remember, this is not Orly Tates. This is not, this is someone who has a serious background in journalism and who has worked her way towards, it looks like, an area of the merger of public interest journalism and activism. And she's doing a conspiracy analysis here in the form of things that we've seen from people like Seth Abramson, and similar sort of horseshoe groups of people will reject this. Most of the same groups of horseshoe people who would have rejected Seth Abramson aren't even aware that this domestic Israeli journalistic analysis has gone down in terms of where this came from. Nothing like this came close to being mentioned in that debate. But it's also not really being mentioned in much of the Palestinian sort of friendly or solidarity media in many ways, I've noticed. All right. Tweet 5 of 31 by Orly Barlev. Quote, "It is no coincidence that the latest round of violence sparked just as Netanyahu failed to form a coalition government, and the mandate to do so was democratically passed to the next party leader, Lapid, who is about to successfully form a coalition with Bennett. 6. Netanyahu is derailing a historic attempt to form a political partnership Jews and Arabs together forming a coalition government. The national unity government would include far-right, center, and far-left parties. Dang, right? I mean, when you think about that's something that we haven't even gotten close to yet in the United States. But that's why this question that you brought up about whether really he was trying to inflame potentially civil war or at least chaos, this kind of deep political chaos, and not just in terms of bombs dropped on Palestinian families or Hamas missiles into Israeli areas, but actually trying to light Israel on fire per se, beyond just the military escalation, but an actual political escalation. Greg, I think you're correct in terms of this, because that was the threat here, was a unity government in many ways. And sure, would the occupation immediately end? Would the power of the Israel lobby immediately end? Would the ongoing covert operations that have been directed even in the West against the West in many ways by Zionist forces, would that immediately end? No, but it would be a crucial key in beginning to unlock the domestic political conundrum that holds this larger political power structure together when you think about it as the Zionist project. Okay.
Yeah, and based on our where we view as far as like the what role of, like, based on our research, based on things we've discussed and things we've found, of a role in actual intentions and actual goals of somebody like Netanyahu, this very well could be some type of ultimately even preemptive or some type of effort ultimately to shift the balance of power away from somebody who I think, much like some of the other people we've discussed within our own American context, of just taking away the balance of power from somebody who's not even interested in the quote-unquote national interest of Israel as a state, as far as like the state of Israel. That's not necessarily even like much like America. I talk about our own political establishment. It may not ideally be like the representation of what you would want, our country to be, for example, but away from this element, this within the state, within Israeli society, that is detrimental to like even or negative towards even like the actual national interest of a state, similar to aspects we've identified here domestically. So it's interesting that this could have been done to get in the way of some type of unity coalition, even to maybe go in that direction away from somebody like a Netanyahu, most likely is not even representing the best interest of like the country he professes to represent. So
yeah. All right. This is Orly Barlev, tweet 7 of 31. Quote, Netanyahu, who is escaping his ongoing trial and potential prison sentence, initiated the wave of chaos in Jerusalem, leading to the hate crimes and violence that have swept the country, as well as the violence between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. Initial facts. Temple Mount, home of Al-Aqsa Mosque, is a sensitive and volatile area any day, particularly during Ramadan month. Home ownership disputes in East Jerusalem neighborhood Sheikh Jarrah is a potential source of tension between Jews and Arabs. Okay, that's the end of tweet number 8. I just want to fill in some background on Sheikh Jarrah and Jerusalem a little bit, and direct people to. I did an interview actually with Richard Silverstein last fall in 2020 when these FinCEN documents came out, and certain Israeli journalists and journalistic establishments followed up on it and found what looks, because part of this FinCEN files were that a lot of this money is shady money that's being allowed to be moved through these big banks, most especially, obviously, something like Deutsche Bank. But what these Israeli journalists, one of them, his name's Uri Blau, found is that the now richest Israeli in the world, Roman Abramovich, who's for recent years been mainly operating out of England, but is a well-known close oligarch to Putin, had seed funded one of the crucial lawfare organizations that also runs cover as a tourist organization in this this is a long-term ethnic cleansing operation in Jerusalem. And remember, like this is one fact that slipped out during the debate, and maybe this was from a questioner. I think actually a caller was during the InfoWars debate, was that Bethlehem was 80% Christian, I think, at some point in 1948, and it's interesting. I interviewed a man who's a professor in Bethlehem of biology and ecology, and he had just been to a protest in Bethlehem and had been tear gassed. But that this ethnic cleansing project is long term, including in Jerusalem, where it's most intensely focused. But Roman Abramovich funded to the tune of $100 million of shadily moved money this group called Elad, which helped largely escalate this current lawfare operation in Sheikh Jarrah, Jerusalem. And so there's an article that I interviewed Richard Silverstein about titled "Russian Oligarch Secretly Funds Jerusalem Settler Ethnic Cleansing Project," and goes into the background there. And he represents, let me just read this first couple paragraphs actually of this article. Quote, "In the 1990s, when Boris Yeltsin began privatizing vast swaths of Russia's industrial output," and by the way, of course, what's not mentioned here is the Harvard boy aspect of this too, right? Of Russia's industrial output, he essentially permitted a group of thuggish entrepreneurs to purchase these state assets for a pittance. They in turn turned their companies into behemoths with a guaranteed monopoly, thus allowing them to become vastly wealthy oligarchs in the process. They were aided in the process by the political elite like Vladimir Putin, who both profited from their wealth and commanded their fealty when collaboration was necessary to pursue his interests. A particular group of these oligarchs was Jewish. Among them were Mikhail Friedman, German Kahn, and remember those are the Alpha Bank guys, Leonid Nevzlin, Yuri Milner, Facebook guy, right? Victor Vekselberg, co-invested, right, with Epstein, Ehud Barak, Peter Thiel, Michael Chertoff in Carbon 9/11. What's her name again? The Eric Prince's apparent handler or whatever. Lashem, Lital Lashem. Yeah.
Yes.
Len Blavatnik, Boris Berezovsky, Arkady Gadayamik, Lev Levayev, and most successful of all, Roman Abramovich. All right, so there's some serious background here that goes back to even these infamous aspects of the Temple Mount and a previous chaos agent of some sort, apparently, Sharon. Remember, what pops in my mind is Cornel West calling Larry Summers the Ariel Sharon of Harvard. And by the way, more interesting direct connections between Larry Summers and Epstein, apparently. Coming out, so it may be even more direct than we even know in many ways. That maybe Summers really is the Sharon of Harvard. Okay, so back to the end of the paragraphs I want to read for this Richard Silverstein article titled "Russian Oligarch Secretly Funds the Jerusalem Settler Ethnic Cleansing Project." Quote, "After they consolidated control of their respective industries and amassed fantastic wealth, they turned their attention to burnishing their reputation, or put it another way, to whitewash all their rapacious piracy with good deeds. They charity washed themselves by investing in liberal Zionist news media, Blavatnik, Haaretz." I didn't know about that aspect. That's interesting. or they bought premier football clubs to showcase their beneficence to sports fans of the UK, Abramovich, Israel, Gadayamek, or they created medical school institutes in their name, Blavatnik again, Harvard Medical School. And it doesn't stop there, actually, with Blavatnik. In return for state authorities winking at their predatory behavior, Putin will often call in favors. For example, in the 2016 U.S. elections, Vekselberg, Oleg Deripaska, another non-Jewish oligarch, and others made illegal donations to the Trump campaign, making similar payments to Trump capo Michael Cohen. Abramovich was known to be close to former Russian oligarch Lev Levayev, who underwent a series of major financial reverses, ending with charges of diamond smuggling, which led him to flee his posh London digs for Russia. He's not been heard from since, which is not surprising considering he's wanted for questioning by Israeli police and Scotland Yard. And final two short pieces here. Short three pieces. Levayev was particularly close to Chabad and one of its most generous donors when he was flush. His jewelry business was known for costuming Hollywood and Broadway stars with lavish diamonds. His Israel-Africa real estate company also built settlements in the occupied territories. Levayev, known for his right-wing politics, might have facilitated Abramovich's interest in supporting the settlement enterprise. A congressional investigation of Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. election turned up a vast trove of documents about figures who played key roles. They were given to BuzzFeed, which shared them with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. The Israeli reporter associated with the consortium is Uri Blau, who broke the Elad Abramovich part of the story in Haaretz. He also collaborated on the BBC report. The documents are banking reports of suspicious account holder transactions filed under a regulation called FinCEN. That's in the U.S. Department of Treasury. Through them, Blau learned that Abramovich was the largest single donor to the Israeli settler ethnic cleansing enterprise run by Elad. He donated $110 million over a 15-year period, which amounted to half the total donations the organization raised. Abramovich, who also owns the Chelsea Football Club, is worth an estimated $13 billion. The Jewish Chronicle estimates he has given about $3 billion to charity over the years, including $600 million to Jewish causes. He became an Israeli citizen in 2018. Considering his charitable giving was over an extended period of possibly 2 decades or more, this is not an especially impressive record. Unquote. I just want to point out that think about how this goes back actually over a while actually. Right. This says over a 15-year period he gave this $110 million. And if you go look at the chart that shows the nature of the money, he was the seed investor of this project. And if you really think about how this sort of led to this heightened moment where this question of East Jerusalem, occupied East Jerusalem, and ethnic cleansing projects, how crucial it is to this current moment. It's very interesting that someone like Roman Abramovich at that level of such a key, obviously an asset of the Russian deep state, just like sort of, what kind of Jewish immigrant to the West could be called on for a favor by the KGB, in terms of what we learned in 90% potentially from the American Compromat, Craig Unger's newest book. Yeah, even the wealthiest and most powerful also do favors for the Russian deep state too. And sure, is this definitely part and parcel of just the long-term, very Israeli, Zionist-directed ethnic cleansing operation and maintenance of these settlements and sort of Judea-sizing Jerusalem? Sure, but this direct and original and massive connection to a Putin-level oligarch is very, 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 very interesting, and I think needs to be factored in terms of understanding the larger geopolitics of this.
And as we're going to talk about when we get more into this, I think we're going to split this up into 2 parts ultimately. We're going to talk more about why, what you said there, why it's so important to look at this simply outside of like the context of how we even have normally looked at like issue of Israel-Palestine as it relates to even the role of like the United States and as far as like the American complicity and support for the activities and the illegal occupation and continued oppression of the Palestinians and the situation there. I do think a different dynamic, and maybe a dynamic that's already been at play, but like it's got to be looked at outside just these parameters that we normally look at it within, like the types of media spheres that you and I come from, and people who listen to us likely come from in terms of like informationally speaking. So,
all right. Thank you, Greg. Let's go back to Orly Bar-Lev, part 9 of her 31 tweet chain that gives the background of Netanyahu's plan to light Israel and Palestine on fire. Okay, quote, Ben Gvir, MK extreme right, publicly suggested in a radio interview that Netanyahu should initiate a military operation which would likely prevent Lapid Bennett from forming a new coalition and maintain Netanyahu's power. A year ago, Netanyahu admitted to receiving a suggestion to set the Middle East on fire by means of provocation in Temple Mount. At the time, he said no. Perhaps he reconsidered.
And real quick, the idea of the provocation in the Temple Mount, of course, that brings you to a lot of the most extreme of the hardline religious Zionist propaganda, both Christian and Jewish, in terms of the so-called end times prophecy goes. And so that's something to keep in mind here, and that's been, I think, it's something that has been pushed at least for a few decades now, pretty hardcore within these within these particular spheres of influence. And that's something to look out for in the future, is the continued talk of like this of just that right there, setting the region on fire by this massive provocation. And that is still, I think, unfortunately, like that's an ace in the hole that still could happen. That could happen at any time. I mean, it's not out of the realm of possibility that something really major still goes down there. So that has been a focal point and a staple of some of the most hardcore religious Zionist propaganda for years now, and I don't think it's going away. So,
and I think we'll go some deeper places with the question of Moscow's secret weapon. Ariel Sharon and the Israeli Mafia, published March 1st, 1986 by EIR, special report. And I think at a later time, Greg, because there's so much to deal with there, and that will then link to the question of Meshulam Reichlis and Biden and the long-term aspect of this network. But I do want to just mention, in terms of, again, talking about the Temple Mount as this site of just the key location for this network to do their provocations, that I just want to mention again that this guy Goldfoot, Stanley Goldfoot, and I'll just quote a little piece from this report, page 40, that's actually talking about a Christian Zionist organization, I believe. Okay, here you go. Quote, Solomon's cult, the faithful of the Temple Mount, sits in the middle of a cluster of institutions associated with Stanley Goldfoot, a Stern Gang killer reported to have played a leading role in blowing up the King David Hotel in the 1940s. And according to his associate, Terry Rissenhoover, quote, a solid legitimate terrorist, unquote. It was Goldfoot's personal lawyer who provided legal services to a crew picked up in 1983 with hundreds of pounds of explosives in their possession at the foot of the Temple Mount. Goldfoot, besides founding the Faithful of the Temple Mount, is the chief Israeli representative of the Christian fundamentalists AJTF. Beginning with the late 1982 contribution of $100,000, the AJTF has poured a small fortune into Goldfoot's efforts and into related land speculation on the West Bank. According to sources in Israel, some of the AJTF funds were used for logistical support for the April 1984 plot to blow up the Dome of the Rock. And then it goes through the background of some of the chief members of that, which includes, as I mentioned, I think before, Pat Robertson and the Ladines. and Barbara's Ladine, and I didn't know about this, role as a Greg, can I just read the paragraph on Michael and Barbara Ladine in this context?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, this is page 41 of Moscow's Secret Weapon, Ariel Sharon and the Israeli Mafia. Quote, Michael and Barbara Ladine. Regarding the Temple Mount plot, Barbara Ladine reported already in 1983, quote unquote, that's my baby. EIR exposés of her role in the plot from her post as an editor of Biblical Archaeology Review, BAR, resulted in her being dropped from the magazine. This, however, did not stop circles in the U.S. Pentagon from hiring her, where she reportedly now works, and from where she continues her role as one of the core activists of the AJTF. And now, Greg, by the way, where does she work now?
You're talking about Ladine.
Barbara Ladine.
Most recently in the Senate office of Senator Chuck Grassley, I believe.
Oh, dang. Huh? Wow.
Right there in the center of the efforts. Once again, it's not judgment one way or the other on the Clintons, but leading the way in terms of the efforts to get the dirt on the Clintons, which ultimately leads to a lot of the narratives that have taken place in terms of around the Clintons that have been, resulted in Trump, and then some of the narratives since then regarding the way we view like the opposition to Trump, for example. So Barbara Ladine being a key player in that.
And what committee? What committee is that?
I believe Grassley is it Judiciary Committee? Let me double check that real quick.
It's a Judiciary. It's not Intelligence. It's maybe it is.
She
oversight.
was Senate Judiciary Committee. Barbara Ladine was working under Grassley on the Judiciary Committee.
And that's so crucial. And this is why this has to be dealt with. This is not just this cannot be explained either by the sort of pseudo rights explanation of the ongoing, just eternal conflict between Muslims and Jews, or the Israel and the Arab world, or the fake left's explanation of this is just another example of settler colonialism, and the U.S. empire is using the Israeli outpost as this leading form of global capitalism, or that doesn't quite explain all of this. And this is why also then it's so obvious that these two guys who tried to set their countries on fire in many ways, even if you just consider the COVID operation that Trump really, at the very least, was an asset to deploy most heavily against the United States in terms of deaths. Now it's come out, it looks like there was twice as many deaths in a COVID context in the United States, almost approaching 1 million potentially, and then if you add in all of the economic genocide that was done and that we've talked about before, as it begins to fully crystallized at the end of the Trump years by that article by Alfred McCoy, after America wakes up and is facing the sort of total erosion of its power on all fronts after Trump. This needs to be dealt with. This is a network of criminals that operates in this way in order to flee from justice. And it's not like they're just outlaws. No, their people are on the Senate intelligence. The Senate judiciary, but also these networks also have players in the Senate intelligence, obviously, too, as we pointed out before, with the reports coming out that the Democratic co-chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee that released Volume 5 with a very highly massaged and lightly covered aspect, especially of the Israeli component, has a direct relationship with the highest levels of the Israeli military intelligence corporate cutout firm, NSO Group, I believe.
And that is Senator Mark Warner, I believe.
Thank you. And Mark Warner, it's basically the family office, meaning like the financial aspects is directly associated. Plus, there's a personal relationship with the Israeli military intelligence figures directly associated with creating NSO Group, which of course is the production of the Pegasus software cyber weapon that was deployed against by Mohammed bin Salman against people like Jamal Khashoggi, but even then directly by MBS against Bezos himself. And surrounding that is not just this question of Khashoggi and in relationship to a pushback not only against MBS in Saudi Arabia, but really at some level you begin to see it as a pushback to the global collusion operation in under the Trump context, that was going on. But at the very same time, it was this question of the Pentagon cloud, the Jedi cloud. Amazon is the leading bidder. They've already done the CIA's cloud. There's, of course, a much bigger background here in terms of the corporate clouds and the dangers there. And I would just mention also that a few hundred, I think, of Amazon employees have petitioned that the company sever its relationship totally with the Israeli military in the wake of this latest atrocity, which is interesting because there is strong connections actually between Amazon and Israel too. But just in terms of the domestic operation and the surrounding aspects of Jedi Cloud, it looks headed towards Amazon. And then Trump, apparently, some kind of network leverage, turns it back to Microsoft. Adalom, Israeli military intelligence founded, Unit 8200 founded, then bought up by Microsoft in the years upcoming to the Jedi Cloud contracting invitation. And then basically put in charge of the Microsoft Azure cloud app security, and then basically turned from Amazon to Microsoft and that whole scenario. And there's more stuff on Gates and Epstein recently also beginning to come out more and more and more too, and which needs to be dealt with, I think. But that larger context, I think, of the NSO group allowing that Pegasus weapon to be deployed at such a high level, not just against human rights activists in places like Mexico or journalists around the world, but against Jamal Khashoggi, who could arguably be said to have been the leading Saudi Arabian journalist and maybe reformist / dissident in the world at a crucial moment during the rise of the global collusion operation under Donald Trump, and of course the Abraham Accords and MBS's whole operation. And remember too how the beginning of QAnon begins to also point to MBS and the taking hostage of all of the other his cousin or his brothers and cousins.
Yeah, the reported role of Blackwater in even carrying out what could be considered torture against Saudi royals, etc. And I don't know how verified that is, but reports of that had come out, and it would make sense if that were taking place, because you think of, like, we talk about MAGA, we also talk about the idea of Mazga, make the House of Saud great again, get the people who have been like funding the terrorists out of there, etc. Although, they didn't really do that, but I mean, that's what the narrative was kind of being pushed within some of these Q circles were. So that would make sense as well.
If you go to early Q, I think you'll find directly that the MBS roundups of whether or not it was Eric Prince and Blackwater holding them hostage at the Ritz-Carlton. But what is verified, of course, is that this happened under the guise of a anti-corruption scenario. MBS consolidated massive power in a way that's never happened. And this, I believe, if you go back to early Q, was put forth as indicators that the white hats were winning, that this was a global anti-corruption operation. And then, of course, this was going to lead to Israel is last for those that were from that kept those clingers on, hoping against hope about the white hat operation of QAnon. But that is so crucial too when you then consider Netanyahu and that if Netanyahu is obviously going to be sort of counted as one of the white hats, obviously by Alex Jones very overtly. And yet I think what you'll see is that a lot of these quote unquote anti-corruption pretexts are done by some of the most corrupt people, and it actually becomes the cover for the deep corruption operation itself. But all of that just to say NSO group crucial, and that these networks are not just outlaws fleeing like Bonnie and Clyde on the highways. No, they're the commanding heights of power, and they have their people who were known back in the 80s to be crucial chaos agents connected to potential black ops against the Temple Mount in relationship to Al-Aqsa Mosque, and those people are still in crucial positions. All right, and so this is the network that should be continued to be investigated in a public fashion, no matter where the Democrats decide to go or not go with it. The Republicans have decided to go nowhere with it, but this needs to be a public investigation, as does continuing the investigation into the actual origins of COVID. Which laboratory was it constructed in, and why? Did someone release it on purpose rather than a lab leak, and who might have done that and why? And then, of course, the touchstone event for the 21st century, September 11th, ongoing crucial touchstone importance to understanding all of these players. And of course, that's one last thing that I would say about that fake debate between Barnes and Fuentes with Alex Jones, was that no one brought up September 11th. There was some milquetoast sort of side mouth little mention of the quote unquote dancing Israelis by Owen Schroyer at the end as a response to the USS Liberty. But during the debate itself, no one even came close to even mentioning a whiff of Israel's credibly accused involvement in September 11th as being central, let alone Netanyahu being I would say, the most credibly accused central figure of the commanding heights in relationship to that event. But at the very least, publicly stated, it's very good. Oh, it's not very good, but it'll generate immediate sympathy. Yeah, that's why you did it, bro.
Yeah, indeed. And I think there was a reference to Saudi Arabia reinforcing that narrative. So
that was Fuentes too.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
Maybe that's why people call you a shill of the Israeli government, because you're helping cover up their involvement in September 11th. Maybe that's why. Okay, that's why the good faith people. All right, let me finish this Michael and Barbara Ledeen paragraph. This is where they deal with Michael. Okay, this is back to page 41 of the EIR special report titled Moscow Secret Weapon, Ariel Sharon and the Israeli Mafia, published March 1st, 1986. Quote, her husband, i.e. Barbara Ledeen, Michael Ledeen, currently a consultant to the National Security Council, co-authored with her a major quote-unquote damage control article in the New Republic following earlier EIR exposés. Ledeen, a longtime dirty tricks man for former U.S. Secretaries of State Kissinger and Haig, was sent by them to Italy in 1981 to cover up their involvement in the Propaganda Due Freemasonic scandal, which brought down the Italian government. A New Republic correspondent in Italy for many years. That's an interesting background. I forgot about that. Ledeen reports that one of the most important influences on his book, Universal Fascism, was the Venetian Count Vittorio Cini, the financial wizard for several of Volpi di Misurata's businesses. Ledeen is a close friend of Stanley Goldfoot, according to Goldfoot. Remember Goldfoot, key Irgun operative, key element to the bombing of the King David Hotel, which is really, that is a crucial event to understanding. I don't think it, that you remember that was like the second fact that I brought up at the Kansas City Public Library incident, which, by the way, three judge panel in the Eighth Circuit recently just released a very short, not on point decision, I would say, a finding against us in the appeal and finding that the district court judge got it right. And we are going to be working to either a rehearing or directly a petition for certiorari at the Supreme Court in relationship to the First Amendment questions. But I dealt with three facts there. One was the very underknown fact described in Margaret Truman, Harry Truman's daughter, her book, describing that the Sterngang Lehi, one of the most, extreme of the Zionist terror groups, had sent mail bombs to Truman in 1947. And then the second fact I brought up was the King David Hotel bombing as a definitional example of Zionist terrorism, and I pointed out that it also included the death of Jews. And by the way, there were Jews who had directly survived European Shoah in its total context, who were also killed in the King David Hotel bombing additionally. And then one more thing about that is let's also put in a link to that very interesting article about Kim Philby's role in apparently disinforming or doing a red herring of the highest levels of UK intelligence in the direct run-up to the King David Hotel bombing, so directing the highest level leadership, I believe, of MI5 to Beirut and Lebanon and away from Jerusalem. And so this was a crucial event, understanding the nature of that and how even at that point, this crucial figure, Kim Philby, who ties in this very Soviet intelligence ring, which would include then apparently the potential fifth man, Victor Rothschild, who's a crucial figure in the background even of bioweapons research and biotechnology in the UK context, but also the crucial, I would say probably the crucial figure in the early support of Israel in terms of things like biotechnology, and I believe he was crucial in helping Weizmann maybe set up the Weizmann Institute. Maybe I can't remember exactly.
The article you're referring to, we're going to link to it in our notes, in our show notes. May 6, 2017, in the Daily Beast, how secret Russian spy Kim Philby helped set up Israel, and it lays out that Beirut story you mentioned.
Okay, thank you very, very much. And it points out that there would be very specific, there's real political incentive by the Soviets to sponsor the Zionist war against the British at that point. Right, because the Zionist project was about driving the British out so that they could be the new mandate and not operate under the British mandate and be able to do their full dreams of the ethnically cleansed Jewish state area. So that's crucial. We'll return back to that because that's a key origin story in terms of the origins not only of the state of Israel and its leadership, most often bathed in a background of political terrorism, sort of unabashedly proud about it, but also the origins of many ways of modern terrorism. So we'll go back into that. All right, I'll just finish up the little bit of this. Page 41 of Moscow's Secret Weapon, Ariel Sharon and the Israeli Mafia. Quote, Ledeen is a close friend of Stanley Goldfoot, according to Goldfoot. Barbara Ledeen has toured the Ataret Kohanim Yeshiva in Jerusalem, run by Goldfoot's friends, the priests in training for the rebuilt temple, unquote. All right, Greg, should we just try to finish up this Twitter thread? And then
I think we should
call this part one.
I think we should. Yeah, let's get into it. But man, there's a lot there because this is bringing out a lot of stuff. So I mean, like I'm increasing my own understanding of. I'm coming to some conclusions just by doing this, like some things that like I wasn't so sure about before. But yeah, let's try to knock this out here. This thread here.
Okay. All right, sounds good. So all right, we left off at.
Number 10.
Number 10. We finished 10 by Orly Barlev. Tweet number 11, quote, the chain of events starting early April, laying the groundwork. April 6, election results are in. Netanyahu receives the mandate to try and form a government. He knows his chances of success are slim. Tweet number 12, quote, April 9th, for the first time after months of nonviolent protests, Israeli police forcibly break up the weekly peaceful protests in Sheikh Jarrah. April 12th, the month of Ramadan begins. Tweet number 13, quote, April 13th, police incites tensions by blockading the Damascus Gate steps, a major gathering place for Jerusalem's Arab Palestinians, particularly during Ramadan. The rarely used blockades served no purpose other than provocation. Outraged Palestinians rioted violently. Tweet number 14, quote, April 18th, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, both religious right-wing extremist MKs, intentionally turn up at the Damascus gate in a provocative anti-Arab move. Following their lead, groups of ultra-right-wing Jewish supremacists begin marching in Jerusalem, chanting, quote, death to Arabs, unquote. Number 15, quote, April 24th, chief of police is caught lying about blockading the steps at Damascus Gate and immediately changes course and orders their removal. Tensions rise, unquote. Tweet number 13 of 31 by Orly Barlev, quote, the unfolding of events, May, setting the fire. May 5th, Lapid receives the mandate. The quote-unquote government of change is days away. May 5th, mayor of Lod, a mixed city, staunch supporter of Netanyahu, invites Ben-Gvir, who then pledges support to the city's Jewish residents, unquote. Tweet number 17, May 6th, on his own accord, Ben-Gvir launches a quote-unquote field office in Sheikh Jarrah, inciting against the local Arabs. There's a photograph below showing it from Haaretz titled The Office, unquote. Tweet number 18, quote, May 7th, in an unprecedented move, Netanyahu-controlled police forces fire stun grenades into Al-Aqsa Mosque and into a medical clinic in the area. All of this during Ramadan, unquote. Tweet number 19, quote, May 7th, paying lip service, Netanyahu orders Ben-Gvir to vacate his quote-unquote office in Sheikh Jarrah once the fire is already raging. Quote, unless you vacate, rockets will be launched at Jerusalem, unquote. Hamas is listening, unquote. Tweet number 20 out of 31 by Orly Barlev, quote, May 8th, police forces shut down the main highway leading to Jerusalem, preventing buses full of Muslim worshippers from getting to Temple Mount. On one of the holiest days of Ramadan, while they are fasting, outrage reaches a boiling point, unquote. Tweet 21, quote, ahead of Jerusalem Day, a national holiday celebrating the unification of the city, there are calls to alter the, quote, flag march, unquote, route away from the Muslim quarter, but the original route still remains, unquote. Tweet number 22, quote, May 10th, Jerusalem Day. Morning, large police forces enter Temple Mount, shooting stun grenades into Al-Aqsa Mosque. Again, violent riots erupt. Noon, the flag march route is altered at the last second. Evening, Hamas launches rockets at Jerusalem, unquote. Tweet number 23 of 31 by Orly Barlev, quote, May 11th and the days that follow, Hamas launches barrages of rockets at half of Israel, including Tel Aviv and the international airport. Millions of Israelis are sitting in bomb shelters. Israel incurs casualties, injuries, and damage, unquote. Tweet 24 of 31, quote, instantly a military response turns into a full-on operation with its own name and goals. Violence in mixed cities erupts, unquote. Tweet number 25, quote, Arab rioters set fire to synagogues, engage in vandalism, looting, and even lynching. Jewish rioters vandalize Arab businesses, cars, and homes, and even engage in lynching. Ben-Gvir turns up in mixed cities while calling on Jews to come and quote-unquote defend Jews. The country is ablaze, unquote.
By the way, real quick, this is lending, I think, some credence to this idea of just like wanting this thing to just spiral as out of control as possible.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, this is why this was their 1-6, I think, in many ways. And because of the pre-existing conditions of this, it had the possibility to go, we were post election day of 2020 last year, the things that Trump was doing, including immediately ripping out and replacing the head of the National Nuclear Security Administration, replacing all the top positions, civilian positions at the Pentagon, that had us very wary of where that might have been headed. And then ultimately, we got the insurrection on 1/6 that's still being covered up by large parts of the political class, bipartisanly, but most obviously by the totality of the Republican Party, really. But of course, Democrat leadership is also never missing an opportunity to miss an opportunity, whether it comes to Nancy Pelosi standing down the core of the impeachment for as long as she could, and then siphoning off the outrage into controlled sort of low-level charges, or standing down Bandy Lee against the wishes of the rest of the Democrats, basically, or Chuck Schumer, the guardian of Israel in the Senate. I would include both of them in the obvious cover-up of the nature of this. But this had the potential to, this could, remember that she said earlier on, that there was a plan that had been put forth. She doesn't say by who, to Netanyahu, to set the Middle East on fire, the entire Middle East on fire, right? And of course, once you get into this situation where rockets are flying, Iran is more directly, materially involved in the backing of Hamas than ever before. It looks like, actually, in terms of the level of the missiles. Then you still have Lebanon and Hezbollah. And there's such this heightened tension with Iran and the rest of Israel's Arab now allies, really, after the Abraham Accords. And there was the potential that this thing could have gone even bigger in terms of the regional aspect of it, obviously, and then of course including the domestic aspect of this. And so it could have gotten even a lot worse. But meanwhile, dozens of children were murdered under the guise of these kinds of sick and twisted politics. All right, back to the thread here. We're on number 26 of 30 by Orly Barlev. Quote, noteworthy, violence in mixed cities is further incited on social media with calls to show up armed with assault instruments. Chief of Police to Netanyahu in Ohana, quote, Ben Gvir is responsible for this intifada, unquote. Netanyahu remains silent on the matter, unquote. All right, tweet number 27, a note on, quote, a note on Hamas. Hamas seizes the opportunity to advance its own agenda, be the quote-unquote defender of Al-Aqsa, sow division between Israeli Arabs and Jews, which would impede the chances to form the government of change, reignite the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, unquote. All right, those are some interesting allegations against Hamas, and they seem fact-based back to me, and it's interesting the way that I've heard, the what I perceive to be the organic Palestinian activists and intellectuals that I've been, listening to, and I've been, been speaking a little bit too, in terms of some of my perspective as a Jewish American patriot of conscience, and the kind of analysis that we've done here, Greg, and how we believe that it could potentially lead into good political things for both the United States and the Middle East, if these kinds of things were more mutually understood by people who have, interests in those different regions, let's say. But they are very careful about the way that they talk about Hamas, because they, of course, and that it would include also the Palestinian Authority, where it comes out of PLO, and that was, of course, a terrorist, quote unquote, terrorist organization, labeled a terrorist organization, and obviously engaged in some aspects of that would have to be called terrorism in terms of violence against civilians in a military capacity. But at the same time, the Palestinians are very careful to reserve all of their rights of resistance in terms of a long-term military occupation. The international law is pretty clear in terms of their rights to resist in a military fashion, even though they don't even have or actually because they don't have a state and an actual military. But of course, at the very same time, what Orly Barlev is saying here is obviously the case. And I would just point out that it looks to me like the way that this the divide and conquer aspect of this, not only in terms of the land of Palestine West and Palestine East, right? Gaza and the West Bank is totally separated, isolated from each other. Before like social media, they were almost entirely isolated and had almost no contact with each other. And now with more of a potential, online and potential more direct communications, the Palestinians are actually beginning to develop an organic, cultural and political solidarity outside of the containment operation of their appointed quote unquote leadership. But I would say that if you see it from like an Israeli security state perspective, and most obviously a Netanyahu perspective, that it's key that they have the quote unquote Palestinian Authority in terms of Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah in managing the West Bank. That's the occupation management interface there. And that's really like the role of the PA in many ways, is to maintain, sort of manage the occupation, not as an actual political leadership to figure out how to end the overall occupation. And then Hamas then in Gaza becomes the perfect sort of the more military oriented, more violence oriented counter gang that can be maintained in a different relationship, to this really an open air prison in terms of shut down Gaza, where it's, they always say the human shield thing Hamas is obviously, it has military strategy as a sort of like an insurgent kind of operation. But it's just like, there's no sites for actual military operations. So then the Israelis then can use that perfectly as an excuse to basically just bomb apartment buildings and kill off the highest levels of medical practitioners and doctors and teachers, and destroy the COVID testing clinic or the bookstores or the roads or the infrastructure, and basically say, well, this terrorist gang Hamas basically brought this on all of the people. And they're very open about that. That's the Israeli military logic, if you want to call it that, is about disproportionate force, that it's about teaching lessons per se, in many ways. And so this whole thing you can see as perfectly orchestrated in many ways, to have these different controlled oppositions, I would say, in terms of those that have been put into the Palestinian leadership. And then that then opens up the door to the whole multinational, the transnational global collusion thing in relationship to Iran in the mix. And what's been brought up here in terms of the role of Hamas to potentially deconstruct any Arab, Palestinian, Israeli. And of course, the way she talks about this, she hasn't mentioned the destruction and the violence against the Palestinians. And so she's obviously, has this Israeli bias to this, but it is interesting to hear the larger domestic political dynamics of the way that this ultimately operates inside of Israel itself. And so then you can then unpack these questions of the more international strategies of tension, and the questions of the larger aspect of clean break, the question of Iran and its increasing influence in the region as a quote unquote unintended consequence of the vacuum left by the Iraq war, and all of that. And then the background of Russia and China and their interest in China's interest in the Belt Road, China basically taking over the financing of one of two major Israeli ports, Russia's interest in playing both sides in Syria, its relationship with Iran. So all of that is in the mix here, in addition to the long-term special U.S.-Israeli relationship, and as you pointed out, the European ongoing maintenance of the Israeli position in many ways, but that there is an uprising in the culture and in the grassroots of an increased knowledge and an increased sense of moral solidarity with ending this occupation in a similar way that was beginning to really escalate against apartheid South Africa. And of course, once again, I'll point out that this background of the relationship between long-term relationship, many decades of relationship between Israel and apartheid South Africa is crucial in not only understanding the background of things like the development of ethno-specific bioweapons in an Israeli biological warfare context, but also of nuclear weapons and the apparent testing of a nuclear weapon off the coast of South Africa, the Vela incident, I think in 1979, that then translates into what was described in that Meet Palestinians and Israelis room, where I described it as actually sort of having to pass through an apparent military checkpoint in order to actually speak your mind in that room, and the policing of political speech. But then I also pointed out that I wanted to speak to my experience of the occupation here in the United States of America as a Jewish American patriot of conscience, and how this goes directly back to things like the spying on American people, the so-called Anti-Defamation League's relationship with South African intelligence, where Israeli intelligence and South African intelligence were both being fed via an ADL managed police informant CIA operative relationship up in the Bay Area, but managed out of the Los Angeles office of the ADL, right in the midst of things like, apartheid South Africa and the rising moves against them. So there is this deep background of the operations here in the United States, where these two apartheid regimes, let's call them, were working together. And the Israelis, I believe, saw that there was going to come a time when something such as boycotting, divesting, and sanctioning was going to become a serious international threat against them. And I do want to mention too that recently Abby Martin's case, they had a victory in showing the Georgia law, the anti-BDS Georgia law, to be unconstitutional. But I would point out in that front too to pay attention, because this is the way that this is all orchestrated. I believe it happened here in Kansas. They basically roll it out. They know it's going to be found unconstitutional to restrict sort of an individual's right to contract with the government without signing a loyalty oath. But then they amp it up to a much more corporate level and not the individual speech level. And I believe that then there won't be as many, potential plaintiffs against it. But also, I think it's going to be easier to argue that the government has its own speech rights in relationship to corporate contracting that can be said to be in the government interest, such as security contracting in the United States with Israeli companies, where it will have a right to not want to do business with corporations specifically that are seeking to boycott Israel. And so I just wanted to clarify that situation. While we have to continue fighting against the seditious nature of those anti-BDS laws, we need to understand the bigger operation here, and that they're very aware that these are going to be found anti-constitutional at the individual speaker level. So I just wanted to point that out. Okay. But I do want one last thing I just remembered is that when I was speaking in that Meet Palestinians and Israelis room, my speech started to be policed immediately when I got into my background, because you're only allowed to tell your personal story is really the way they kept it all framed and neutralized politically. And I called them out for policing Palestinian speech, different from Israeli speech, as I think I mentioned before. But it was when I started talking about my experience as a Jewish American patriot of conscience, peace activist, not knowing this background of how deeply involved the Israel lobby was in the Iraq War, and then reading aspects of the Israel lobby and Mearsheimer and Walt, and then I was going into talking about how Netanyahu, the same guy who set this entire latest round of violence that destroyed lives on quote-unquote both sides, was the same guy that was put forth as the quote-unquote voice of the entirety of the Israeli national interest in the run-up to the Iraq War. And it was at that moment that they shut me down on that stage. And so I said, peace out. But I thought that was very interesting, that is, I believe, an indicator that the experience of we who are in the United States in relationship to the occupation dynamics in the United States by Zionist forces is the really delicate part here, and I believe represents part of the Achilles heel of the project more in general.
Very true.
All right, we're almost there, Greg. Should I keep going?
Yeah, let's get through these last few here. It's going to get into the more of the MO of Netanyahu. So, and then this will be the last few posts here. We got, I think, 4 more to go here.
All right, we're on number 28, I think. So 3 more.
Yes.
Orly Bar-Lev. I forget what this titled again. That's titled in a very interesting way about how Netanyahu planned to...
The chain of events led by Netanyahu to set fire to Israel to cling to power.
Yeah, but why wouldn't she say Palestine? So obviously this, morally I have an issue with this, but meanwhile, just because it's similar to our work in an American context where there's political dimensions where we disagree with certain investigators or they're leaving things out, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't at least consider their facts and analysis, so.
We consider what they're covering and the importance of, this particular matter of, the role of a Netanyahu, You don't have to agree with everything, but sometimes, to get to the important information, you can not excuse or condone these, but at the same time, you kind of have to take the good with the bad in cases like this.
Yes. All right. And you'll see she sort of delivers the bad at the end, I'd say, in terms of the unfairness of it, of the perspective. But this is crucial. All right. Number 28. I think she adds, you're right, Greg, there's 4 more because she adds a 31st at the end. Okay. All right. Number 28 by Orly Bar-Lev. Quote, Netanyahu's MO, creating provocations himself as well as incitement by means of messengers, followed by quote-unquote calming actions that serve as ostensible placating. 1. Removal of the unprecedented blockades at Damascus Gate after the fact, unquote. Number 29, quote, 2. Ordering Ben-Gvir to vacate his quote-unquote office in Sheikh Jarrah. 3. Rerouting the flag march. 4. Calls for de-escalation of violence after the fact.
It reminds me of a Trump after everything had gone down at the Capitol. Oh, let's not be violent.
Exactly. Pouring a glass of water on a massive fire is an attempt to manufacture an alibi for the pyromaniac in chief, unquote. Right? It does sound very much like Trump, like you're saying, really. And so it's hard to know exactly was it meant to be this contained, or was it supposed to go a little bit further? We'll see, I guess, politically what comes of this too. All right, number 30. Quote, to be clear, Hamas is a murderous terrorist organization and Israel must defend itself. Violent rioters must be arrested and prosecuted. They are operating on their own accord. However, some are taking advantage of the tensions, sparking the match that lit the flame, unquote. And then the 31st one, quote, it's no coincidence that Israel was set on fire just as a government of change was about to be established. The timeline tells the story. Inescapable conclusion. Netanyahu set in motion an orchestrated plan to set the ground on fire to maintain power and escape his trial, unquote. He didn't just set the ground on fire orally. He set human beings on fire and killed them. All right. So, but that's just my, my human outrage at how horrific the atrocities by by the Israeli government were. And it's not, I'm not discounting that there was, quote unquote, both sides suffered. People died in Israel. And it does feel terroristic to be under just a general assault of these hundreds, if not thousands of these rockets, coming from Hamas, especially as just an average Israeli person who's not, directly involved in any of this. And so that's why it is important to understand this as a strategy of tension, but in a much bigger way than I believe Orly Bar-Lev has the capacity to even consider, in terms of how it's very possible this is the entirety of the Israeli project could be considered this kind of project, I think. And that's, probably horrible to hear by any patriotic Israeli, but to me, it looks like the scenario. And at the very least, you have a apartheid situation that is morally and politically untenable in our day and age. And so there's bigger questions looking to be resolved here, but understanding these long-term specific political dynamics of this set of players is crucial, especially as the same network in the United States and its backers and the so-called independent right-wing so-called patriot media hold these totally falsified, I think their main function. Now, I'm not saying this is why Alex Jones specifically did this, but the way that they function, this specific debate, is almost totally to distract from the fact that this network of Netanyahu, who was originated this round of conflagration, is the exact same network that put in their still god political emperor Trump to this day, and that they're covering it up, these same kind of operations in an American context. And that includes 9/11, as we pointed out.
And their potential foreign would-be godlike figure, Putin, also being central to this via the role of what we talked about before with these, these Russian oligarchical organized crime aspects. So it's a very tangled web, and I think we will we're going to wrap up for now on this, but we're going to do a part 2. I think we're going to delve even more into some of the specifics of like where Barnes and Fuentes, I think, went so wrong in this quote debate, and some of a little more in depth about it in a second part here. But I'm glad we read through this timeline here. It's very just reading through it, like things are coming to me as like we're just going through it, and so it's very interesting to take that apart and pick apart some of the dynamics there. And so,
all right, and we'll delve more into the American side here and what's going on in terms of Biden and Blinken and the still ongoing influence of the Meshulam Reichless network and the Epstein-Maxwell network in relationship to all of this, also as we continue to unpack this moment. And it also, I guess it looks also, and finally, that there is one last tweet from Orly Bar-Lev where she says, quote, "I talked about it on my latest Independent News Edition video, which went viral in Israel. Now it's with English subtitles." So we'll include the link to the entire thread where that video is posted. But I guess until next time, Greg, thank you.
All right, thank you.
And thank you all so much for listening and interacting with us. All right, Antidote, we out.